With 87% of Australians still using cash, how is this trend impacting the QSR sector? To explore this, we have Graham Cook from Finder. Graham, what changes in consumer behavior are you noticing in QSR payment transactions?
So yeah, you're correct. We see over 80% of Australians say they're still using cash. The caveat though is they're not all using cash necessarily regularly. If you look at market data of the number of ATM withdrawals in Australia, for example, you can see that number continuing to go down very consistently over about the last 7 or 8 years. There was a bit of a recovery post-COVID. Obviously, nobody could go out during COVID, so nobody was taking money out from ATMs. There's been a bit of bounce back since then. A lot of cash advocate groups are citing that bounce back as reasons that the cashless economy is far away from reality. But actually, if you look at the longer term slant or change of ATM withdrawals over time in Australia, it's bounced back about to where it would have been if the previous downward trend continued. So overall, people are taking out less cash in Australia. And I've seen stats of about 8, 9, or 10% of transactions right now taking place in cash, with 90% currently taking place via credit card.
But despite still having many cash users, why are some restaurants moving to cashless?
Yeah, that's a good question. So a lot of people talk about cashless transactions in terms of the extra cost burden to retailers and to consumers. So usually in Australia, you have to pay a small extra fee if you pay with your card, whether it's a credit card or a debit card, 1 or 2%. Legally, a retailer can't charge any more than the cost that they bear for facilitating that transaction. So there is a cost, but often it can be passed on to the consumer. A lot of people don't really consider that there's also a cost in handling cash for businesses. If you get, for example, those vans that come and pick up cash, those security vans, they're very expensive to have a contract with and maintain to your business. So by eliminating cash when only 10 or 15% of transactions take place via cash, businesses can make a significant saving, which is why we're seeing more and more, specifically catering businesses, kind of make this move recently.
So would you say that cashless operations somehow impact consumer behavior and dining experience?
Yeah, I think this is a trend that is not going to reverse anytime soon. One of the interesting things we've seen in data for consumers in Australia over the last few years is a big increase in online shopping. Around the time of COVID, people increasingly started buying their groceries online, for example, and buying things via that method. And even though the cost of living crisis is biting, even though the cost of living pressures in Australia are very high, Finder's cost of living pressure gauge is currently sitting in the extreme range where it has been for 2 years. Even though those pressures are there, Australians still are shopping increasingly heavily online and haven't pulled back from that increased spending that we saw during COVID. So convenience is king, even though expenses are pretty high. And I think that's one of the reasons we probably won't see people go back to paying with cash, even though it costs a little bit more to pay with card.
And considering everything that you've mentioned, Graham, where would you say is the cashless trend in Australia going?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of talk of cashless society. The question really is, how cashless do you need to be a cashless society? Is it coming, or is it potentially already here? I would argue that when 90% of transactions in a country are taking place digitally, that we're already in a cashless society. The number of businesses who only accept cash is quite small right now. The number of consumers only using cash is quite small right now. I would expect as the population ages, that percentage to decrease, and the percentage of transactions taking place via cash to decrease further. So I would argue that we probably already are in a cashless society and there's no going back.
Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your insights, Graham.
Thanks, Jess.
Once again, that was Graham Cook, Head of Consumer Research at Finder. For more news, visit qsrmedia.com.au.